April 3rd, 1987. That was the spring every farmer in Calloway County decided the future had finally arrived, and it came in rolls of bright orange plastic fencing stacked outside Buren's Feed and Hardware on Route 9. The salesman's name was Dale Whitmore, and he had driven down from Lexington in a white company truck with the AgriShield logo printed on both doors. He set up a folding table in the parking lot on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday afternoon he had sold 47 rolls to 11 different farms. The pitch was simple, and it worked. Plastic boundary fencing, UV treated, guaranteed for 15 years, posts included, no maintenance required, installable in a single afternoon with 2 men and a post driver. $68 per 100 feet. The farmers of Calloway County were practical men. They had been fighting wooden fence rot for generations, splitting posts, rusting wire, warping boards that let hogs through and kept nothing else in. Whitmore's fencing snapped together, held its color, and did not require painting. By the end of April, nearly every farm bordering the east ridge of Sycamore Valley had the bright orange plastic running along their field edges. Some put it along the creekside slopes. Some ran it straight down the drainage easements where the land dropped sharply toward the valley floor. It looked clean and modern and definitive. Walter Hebb watched all of it from his truck. He parked at the end of his gravel drive each morning that week with a thermos of black coffee and watched the neighbors work. He watched Gary Pelton's 2 boys driving posts along the creek bank with a rented pneumatic driver. He watched the Dunmore brothers stretch orange plastic across their entire southern edge, a quarter mile of it pulled tight and locked into place. He watched Dale Whitmore stop at one farm and then the next, his order book filling. Walter did not go to Buren's. He did not call Whitmore's number. He drove back to his barn, picked up his planting fork, and went to work on the east edge of his property, where his land dropped 8 feet over 30 yards toward the valley drainage. He had been planning what he was about to do for 2 years, watching the way water moved during the wet springs, noting where the soil went soft, counting the days after heavy rain before the ground firmed again. He had walked that edge in every season and in every kind of weather. He knew what happened there when too much water came too fast. He spent 3 days in late April planting. He planted hawthorn and osage orange and wild privet in a staggered double row along the entire eastern slope of his property, 412 linear feet of it. He planted them 18 inches apart, alternating species, pressing each root ball into soil he had prepared by hand, with a digging bar and a bucket of compost he had been turning since the previous autumn. The plants were small, most of them barely knee-high, purchased from a native nursery outside of Bowling Green for a total of $7.40. The rest grown from cuttings he had taken from an old hedgerow on the back of his property that had been standing since before his father was born. Gary Pelton drove by while Walter was on his knees pressing soil around a hawthorn root ball on the second day. He slowed, looked, and shook his head through the open window. "Walter, what in the world are you doing?" "Planting," Walter said. "I can see that." "Planting what?" "Hedge." Pelton was quiet for a moment. Then, "That won't even hold a goat." He drove on. By the end of the week, every farm on the East Valley slope had orange plastic fencing. Walter Hebb had 400 feet of sticks in the ground, none of them taller than his knee, arranged in a crooked double line that looked, by honest assessment, like nothing at all. Walter Eugene Hebb was 61 years old in the spring of 1987, and he had farmed the same 190 acres in Calloway County for 38 years, inheriting the land from his father at age 23 when a tractor accident took the older man in the winter of 1949. He had never sold an acre. He had never borrowed more than he could repay in one season. He ran a mixed operation, corn, hay, and a small cow-calf herd, and he kept meticulous records in a composition notebook that he replaced each January. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but not given to talk for its own sake. At the co-op, he listened more than he spoke. At church, he sat in the fourth pew on the left and did not volunteer opinions. His neighbors respected him in the way rural communities respect a man who causes no trouble and asks for nothing, which is to say, they respected him largely by leaving him alone. He had learned what he knew about land and water and plants from his father, who had learned it from his own father, who had come to Kentucky from Pennsylvania in 1901 and spent 40 years farming the same creek-adjacent soil that Walter now farmed. His grandfather had planted the original hedgerow on the back of the property in 1908, a thick wall of Osage orange and hawthorn running along the north fence line, and Walter had watched that hedgerow slow runoff, hold soil, shelter cattle, and stand through every storm for as long as he had been alive. He had never seen it fail. He had seen everything around it fail. Fences, drainage tiles, a concrete retaining wall his father had poured in 1939 that cracked in the freeze of 1963 and had to be torn out. The hedgerow simply stood. When Walter walked his eastern slope in the wet springs of 1985 and 1986 and watched the soil move, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but steadily, a thin brown sheet of topsoil releasing from the slope and traveling toward the valley floor with every hard rain. He thought about his grandfather's hedgerow. He thought about roots. He thought about the difference between something that holds because it is fastened and something that holds because it has grown. He bought his plants. He spent $7.40. He put them in the ground. Dale Whitmore heard about the hedge within a week of the planting and made a point to drive past Walter's property on his way out of the county. He stopped at Pelton's afterward and had coffee at the kitchen table and told Gary that the old man on the ridge had lost his mind. "Planting thorns," Whitmore said. "In 1987, when you can have engineered polymer fencing with a 15-year structural guarantee." Gary's wife refilled the mugs. "He's always been particular," she said, which was the most generous construction anyone in Calloway County placed on the matter. Whitmore sold 6 more rolls of fencing before he left the county. He told the story of the thorn hedge at the next farm, and the one after that, as a kind of punchline, and it landed well each time because it was genuinely funny. A man in the age of polymer engineering spending 3 days on his knees planting sticks. At the feed store in May, someone asked Walter directly, "What's your plan with those plants, Walter? You putting in a fence?" "In a manner of speaking," Walter said. "Whitmore's stuff is a lot easier." "I expect it is," Walter said, and bought his feed and drove home. The hedge grew through the summer of 1987, slow and low, the plants reaching 2 feet by September. In 1988, they reached 3.5 feet, branching and thickening, the hawthorn especially dense, already beginning to weave into itself where the staggered rows met. Walter walked the line each spring and wove the new growth deliberately, bending flexible new shoots horizontally and threading them through adjacent branches, a technique called laying that he had seen his grandfather perform on the back hedgerow and had watched carefully enough as a boy to understand the logic. Not just height, but density. Not just a wall, but a woven structure where each branch held the next, and the roots of 40 different plants gripped the soil in a continuous underground network. By 1989, the hedge was 5 feet tall in most sections and impenetrable enough that his cattle would not push through it. The roots had been growing for 3 years by then, reaching down and outward through the slope soil in a pattern no engineer had designed and no diagram could fully represent. They followed water. They found weakness. They filled space. The Pelton boys drove past it one afternoon in the fall of 1989, and the older one said it looked like something out of England. The younger one said it looked like a lot of work for what a roll of plastic could do in an afternoon. They were not wrong about the work, but they were measuring the wrong thing. The rain began on a Thursday evening in late May of 1991 and did not stop. It had been a wet spring across the whole region, 4 inches above normal through March and April, and the ground across Sycamore Valley was already carrying as much moisture as it could hold. The water table on the east slope had been sitting high since February. Walter had noticed it when he walked the hedge line in April. The soil was soft, further from the drainage than it normally was this late in the season, and the little seasonal creek that ran along the base of the valley slope was already running full a month ahead of its usual schedule. He had noted these things in his composition notebook. He had not mentioned them to anyone. The storm that arrived Thursday night was not a tornado system and not a named event. The radio called it a slow-moving frontal boundary, which meant it was going to sit over the county and pour. It poured 2 inches Thursday night, 4 more through Friday. The creek at the valley bottom doubled in width by Friday afternoon and was still rising. By Friday evening, farmers along the East Ridge were standing at their windows watching the runoff sheets forming on their fields. Gary Pelton called his brother-in-law in Paducah that night and got no answer. He called the county emergency line and got a recording telling him the line was at capacity. He walked to the edge of his slope in the dark with a flashlight and shone it down the field and watched brown water running in a continuous sheet off the higher ground, finding the furrows, following them, carrying soil. His plastic fencing was still standing. He went to bed. By Saturday morning the situation had changed. The frontal boundary had stalled completely overnight and delivered another 2.5 inches in the dark. The seasonal creek was no longer a creek. It had spread 60 yards beyond its normal channel and was moving fast, some brown and opaque, carrying sticks and fence posts, and a single wooden pallet that had come from somewhere upslope. The valley floor fields, the bottom corn ground that every farmer prized because the soil there was deep and rich and flat, were under 2 feet of standing water. But the real crisis was the slope. The slope fields, the higher angled ground above the valley floor, were the fields where the erosion happened. When water came off the ridge in volume and hit the angled terrain, it did not just wet the ground. It moved the ground. The topsoil on those slopes was 6 to 9 inches deep in most places, built up over a century of careful farming, and it was irreplaceable in any practical human time frame. When it went with the water. Gary Pelton came outside at 7 Saturday morning and understood within 60 seconds that his plastic fencing was in serious trouble. The posts were holding in most places, but the problem was not the posts. The problem was that the plastic fencing had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had formed a barrier. And now that barrier was catching debris and damming the lateral flow of water across the slope, which was concentrating the runoff into specific points. The post gaps, the low corners, the spots where the fencing met the natural contours of the terrain. And at those concentration points, the water was cutting channels, deep ones. The soil on the downslope side of his fencing was not just washing away, it was being excavated. By 8 o'clock, the first section of fencing on the Pelton South Field gave way. It did not snap slowly. The concentrated water pressure at one post gap had been building for 2 hours, and when it released, it took 16 feet of fencing with it in under 4 seconds, the plastic peeling off the posts themselves pulling from the saturated soil, the whole section folding downstream in an orange curl that caught in the moving water and disappeared toward the valley. The gap it left was a raw wound in the field edge, soil on both sides cut clean and vertical, water pouring through in a 3-foot-wide column. By 9 o'clock, 4 sections had gone on Pelton's property and 2 on the Dunmore brothers' south fence line. The Dunmore boys were in the field with shovels, which accomplished nothing except to confirm how bad things were. Dale Whitmore's UV treated. She 15-year guaranteed polymer fencing was failing across the entire east slope of Sycamore Valley, not because it was poorly made, but because it was solid where it should have been porous, rigid where it should have bent, and fastened to soil that could no longer hold a post. By 10 o'clock, neighbors had gathered at the Pelton field edge, 5 farmers standing in rain gear watching the slope unravel. The conversation was the kind that has no productive content because there is nothing productive to be done. Someone said they should call the county. Someone else said the county was busy with the valley floor flooding. A third man said his entire south fence line was gone, and he was looking at 12 acres of corn ground that was going to lose its topsoil before noon. Nobody said anything about Walter Hebb, but every one of them could see his property from where they stood. The hedge line on Walter's eastern slope had been standing for 4 years. In that time, it had become something that was genuinely difficult to describe to someone who had not seen a laid hedge in its proper development. It was not a row of plants. It was a structure, 5.5 feet tall in most sections, 6 feet in others where the hawthorn had grown particularly well, dense enough at the base that you could not see through it even in winter, the branches of adjacent plants woven and interlocked in a pattern that Walter had guided, but that the plants themselves had ultimately determined. The root system below it was 4 years old and ran deep and lateral through the slope soil in a continuous mat, plant connected to plant not above ground only, but below, or a living network anchored into the earth with the grip that only time and growth can create. When the concentrated runoff from the ridge hit Walter's hedge line at approximately 10:30 Saturday morning, it did not find a gap. It did not find a post under pressure. It found roots. The water spread laterally along the hedge base, searching for weakness, finding the woven branches slowing its surface movement, finding the root mass breaking its underground pressure into 1,000 smaller channels, each of which carried water slowly down and through the soil rather than across and over it. The hedge was permeable in the way that living things are permeable, not a wall that blocks, but a resistance that filters, slows, and redirects. The soil on Walter's slope did not move. The water moved through it, and slowly, and with most of its erosive force already spent by the time it reached the roots. Gary Pelton saw it first. He was standing at his field edge watching his own slope continue to lose soil when he turned and looked south toward Walter's property line and registered slowly what he was seeing: the hedge, the green wall, and below it, on Walter's lower slope, the field was wet, but it was intact. The surface was holding. The soil was not moving. He stood and looked at it for a long time. He walked to the fence line between his property and Walter's, the old board fence that Walter maintained on the conventional side of his property, and he looked along the length of the hedge from the outside. The water was at the hedge base. The roots were doing what roots do when they have had 4 years to do it. The ground held. On Pelton's side of that fence line, the story was the opposite. 4 sections of orange polymer fencing were gone. The gaps were still cutting, still widening. He could see the exposed subsoil on the channel edges, the pale yellow clay that meant the topsoil layer was gone at those points, not thinned, but gone, removed to the valley floor where it would settle in someone else's field or in the creek channel or somewhere beyond recovery. He walked back to the group of farmers at his field edge and said, "Walter's hedge is holding." 3 of the 4 men looked toward Walter's property. The 4th looked at his boots. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the Dunmore brothers said, We should go talk to him." Walter was in his barn when they came. He had been there since 7 in the morning, and watching the rain gauge he kept nailed to the barn door frame, writing numbers in his composition notebook at hourly intervals. He had walked the hedge line at 6, before the worst of the morning flow had begun, and he had seen what he expected to see. The water coming to the hedge and slowing, the roots holding, the system working exactly as the 4-year-old hedgerow on the back of his property had worked for 80 years. He heard the truck tires on the gravel and came to the barn door. Gary Pelton was in front. Behind him were the Dunmore brothers and 2 other farmers from the north end of the slope. Ray Combs and his neighbor Lou Setzer, who had put in the most extensive plastic fencing of anyone on the East Ridge, nearly 900 feet of it, and who had, by Walter's later estimate, lost more topsoil that morning than any other single farm in the valley. Pelton took off his hat when he got to the barn door. "Your hedge is holding," he said. "I know," Walter said. "Ours is gone." Pelton paused. "A lot of it." "I know that too?" There was quiet for a moment, the sound of rain on the barn roof, steady and relentless. Lou Setzer was looking at the floor of the barn. Ray Combs was looking at Walter with the specific expression of a man who has no language yet for the thing he is trying to say. "How did you know?" Combs asked finally. 4 years ago. How did you know this was going to happen?" Walter leaned against the barn door frame and was quiet for a moment, not because he was thinking of what to say, but because he was deciding how much of it to say. "I didn't know this was going to happen," he said. "I knew what roots do, and I knew what posts in wet ground do. I planted something that would grow into the problem instead of something that would sit on top of it." Setzer looked up. 900 feet, he said. It was not entirely clear what he meant. He meant the fencing he had lost, and he meant the money, and he meant the topsoil, and he meant the morning he had spent watching his field edge come apart. "I know," Walter said. Pelton put his hat back on. "Will you show us what you planted and how you did it?" Walter nodded once, picked up his coat from the hook by the barn door, and led them out into the rain. He walked them along the hedge line from the north end to the south. He did not lecture. He answered questions when they were asked and was quiet when they were not. He showed them where the roots were closest to the surface. You could see the slight mounding of soil along the hedge base where the lateral roots ran. And he showed them the woven branch structure, how each plant supported the next, how the gaps that remained in the canopy were small enough to slow water movement but large enough to allow drainage rather than damming. He showed them the difference between his downslope field, wet, intact, surface unbroken, and the view across the fence line to where Pelton's soil had moved. He knelt at one point and pressed his hand into the soil at the hedge base. It was saturated, but firm. The root mass beneath his palm was dense enough to feel through 6 inches of topsoil. "A post holds until the soil around it can't hold any more," he said. "A root holds because it is the soil after a while. You can't separate them." He stood up. Rain ran off the brim of his hat. "How long until a hedge like this is established?" the younger Dunmore brother asked. 3 years before it does real work," Walter said. 4 before you trust it in something like this." The younger Dunmore looked at the hedge, then at the ruined field edge across the fence line, then back at the hedge. "So we'd have needed to start in 87, he said. 88 at the latest, Walter said. Nobody said anything else for a while. By Sunday the rain had stopped. The valley floor took 3 days to drain. The slope fields that had lost fencing sections took longer to assess because the damage revealed itself in stages. You could not know how much topsoil had moved until the water receded, and you walked the ground and felt how shallow the remaining layer was in the cut zones. Ray Combs lost 4 inches of topsoil across 6 acres of his south slope. The Dunmore brothers lost a section of field edge that had cut back 8 feet from the original boundary. Gary Pelton's losses were moderate by comparison. 2 sections of deep cut, the rest of the fencing damaged but holding. Though moderate in this context still meant soil that had been building since the 1880s was now on the valley floor. Lou Setzer's farm was the worst. Of the 900 feet of plastic fencing he had installed, 640 feet had failed. The failure had been progressive. Once the first sections gave way and the concentrated pressure released, adjacent sections lost their capacity to hold within minutes. His south slope, which was the steepest ground on his property, and the ground he had specifically fenced because it was most vulnerable to runoff, had lost its topsoil layer across nearly a third of its surface area. Standing in his field on Monday morning, pressing his boot into the pale, exposed clay, he understood in a way that could not be undone that this ground would not grow corn the way it had grown corn for a generation. The work of recovering it, if it could be recovered, was measured in decades, not seasons. He drove to Walter's farm on Monday afternoon alone. Walter was at the hedge line when Setzer's truck pulled in. I'm walking the length of it as he did each spring, checking for winter damage, noting new growth. He heard the truck and walked back to the drive. Setzer climbed out slowly. He was a large man, built like his grandfather who had cleared the original timber on his property in 1931, and the slowness with which he moved was not his natural pace. He stood at the truck door for a moment, looking at Walter. "I'm going to tell you something," Setzer said, "and I need you to just let me say it." Walter waited. "In '87 I drove past while you were planting those things, and I thought you'd lost your mind. I told my wife that night. I said old Hebb's out there planting sticks, and he's going to have a yard full of thorns and nothing to show for it in 10 years. I said it more than once." He paused. "I said it to Whitmore when he came around. And I bought 900 feet of his fencing, and I thought I'd done the smart thing." Walter looked at him steadily. "I was wrong," Setzer said. "Not just about the storm. About all of it. About what I was actually looking at when I drove past you that spring." Walter nodded slowly. "You were looking at something that hadn't done anything yet," he said. "That's a hard thing to have faith in. You had faith in it." "I had knowledge of it," Walter said. "My grandfather planted the hedgerow on the back of this property in 1908. I watched it for 40 years before I put my own hands in the ground. That's not faith. That's watching something work for long enough that you trust it." Setzer was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you help me plant? This fall, or whenever the right time is. I want to do it the way you did." "I'll help you," Walter said. They shook hands at the truck. Setzer held the grip for a moment longer than a normal handshake, the way a man holds something when words have run out. The story moved through Calloway County the way rural stories move, not through newspapers or broadcasts, but through conversation, specific and personal, and passed from one person to the next at the places where farmers gathered. At Buren's Hardware the following Saturday morning, 3 men who had not been on the east slope that weekend had already heard a version of it. By the following week, the version had acquired detail and shape, the way true stories do when the people telling them were actually there. Dale Whitmore drove back through the county 6 weeks later with a new order book and a revised pitch about drainage-compatible fencing systems. He stopped at Pelton's, where he had made his first sale in 1987. Gary listened to the pitch and then told him what had happened on the slope in May. Whitmore listened carefully, because he was a salesman, and a salesman listens for the shape of the objection. Then he drove past Walter's property on his way to the highway. He slowed when he reached the hedge line. He stopped completely, He sat in his truck for a long moment, looking at the structure from the road, the 6-foot wall of woven hawthorn and osage orange and wild privet, dense and dark green in the early summer light. The kind of thing that looks like it has always been there because in all the ways that matter, it always will be. He drove on without writing it in his order book, but he drove slowly. Gary Pelton pulled out his failed fence posts through June and July, working section by section, stacking the orange polymer rolls at the edge of his drive. He ordered plants from the same native nursery outside Bowling Green that Walter had used. Walter came over on a Saturday in late August and walked the slope with him, marking the planting line with small flags, showing him the stagger, explaining the spacing. He showed him how to read the slope for water movement, where the natural channels formed, where the soil was thinnest, where the roots would need to do their most important work. Pelton's son was there that day, a boy of 14 who had watched the storm from the farmhouse window in May and would never forget what he had seen. He followed the two men along the slope, listening without asking questions, watching Walter's hands when he touched the soil. He would plant his own hedge in 1997 on his first farm before anyone told him to. Lou Setzer planted 500 feet of hedge that fall along his worst slope. He planted it the way Walter showed him. Double staggered row, native species, 18-inch spacing. He pressed each root ball in himself, kneeling in the October mud, understanding for the first time that the kneeling was not a lesser thing than driving posts from a standing position. The kneeling was the thing. The contact with the ground was the thing. He kept the last intact section of his orange plastic fencing, a 12-foot length that had held because it happened to be on level ground, and he hung it in his barn where he could see it from the equipment door. He was not entirely sure why he kept it, but he did not throw it away. Walter's hedge continued to grow. By 1993 it was 7 feet in the tallest sections, thick enough at the base that a man could not push his arm through it. The root network below the slope now so extensive that the soil across his entire eastern face had changed in character. Better drained in wet springs, more moisture retentive in dry summers, more biologically active in every season. His corn yields on the slope ground had increased modestly but steadily in each of the 4 years since planting, which he had noted in his composition notebook without particular comment. He maintained his equipment and farmed his land. He kept his records and walked his field edges and pressed his hand into the soil at the hedge base each spring to feel whether the roots had reached further, which they always had. Nothing about him changed, because nothing about him had needed to change. He had simply looked at a slope and understood that the only thing that lasts in soil is what has grown its way into it. Everything else is a post waiting for the ground to soften. The hedge stood.